Welcome to Norse Code, the number one podcast for your Minnesota Vikings. Your host with the moster is me, Dusty O'Connell. Joining me as usual, Vikings blogger extraordinaire, training camp guide author, generally useful human, and actually excellent Pokemon custom name creator, Arif Hassan. How you doing, Arif?
I'm pretty good. I take pride in my Pokemon nicknames, so yeah.
They represent a degree of cleverness that cannot be found without significant effort. Like, I feel like you've put a lot of work into it.
Yeah, well, like, sometimes it's just like, this is a deep dive, but I don't really like... Well, the Venomoth, it took me forever. I don't have a really good nickname for the Venomoth, but most of them I come up with within 5 minutes of catching it.
Or you already have a name and you just want, like, your Pokemon to evolve. Like, I imagine you already had, like, a pretty good name for a Vaporeon before you were able to evolve one of your many EVs into one.
Yeah, no, that's true too. You come up with, like, so for example, I have a Growlithe. I named him Little Doggo. When I evolve him to an Arcanine, he'll be Big Pupper.
Aww. Growlithe may be the cutest Pokemon to capture. Like, when it shakes its fur and barks at you, you're just like, aw, come here, little guy.
Yeah, and also, I think, retains its cuteness as it evolves. Like, some of the cute ones, like the Nidorans, they evolve into, like, Nidoking and Nidoqueen. Not very cute.
True, Arcanine is both menacing and adorable.
Yeah, so it's an elite Pokemon from that perspective.
Hashtag no rares.
Just caught them, didn't buy them.
Exactly. We around here, we're not about paying money for mobile games. We can't buy 100 Pikachu coins like the 1/10 of 1% could.
Right. They're just subsidizing us.
Exactly. Even though I will catch up more slowly, I will one day claim every gym in my neighborhood, and it will all be on the strength of Pokemon that I have trapped and honed to lethal fighting machines.
Get the homegrown Pokemon here.
So now that people listened to the first minute of the show and it was all about Pokemon and they all turned it off, this would be a good time to thank those of you who stuck around for your ongoing support of Norse Code, both in download and contribution form. We really appreciate being somebody, I think it was Skol88 on Twitter, specifically called us out as being the best Vikings podcast by far. So thank you, Skol.
I really appreciate that.
We think so too. We didn't arrive at the decision to call ourselves number one easily. There was a lot of thought.
Took much deliberation, analysis, analytics.
Exactly. A lot of analytics went into it. There was a lot of, comparing our content to that of others. And, we decided that we were pretty cool. And we're glad you think so too. So please do us a favor. Spread the word as the season is starting. Like, as you're, at the bar or whatever, you've got your 3-inch binder that's full of the training camp guide and you're frantically flipping through, trying to figure out which scheme the Vikings are, running on a given drive. Or you already know because you memorized the guide in advance of the season. Your friends will be like, "What's that? How did you learn so much about the Vikings? Where did you get all this stuff?" And then you can say, "Well, useful human Arif Hassan wrote this guide, and he's the host of the number one podcast for your Minnesota Vikings, Norse Code." And then just direct them to NorseCodePodcast.com or DailyNorseman.com, because I'm sure they would enjoy the traffic as well if your friends are not already dedicated Daily Norseman viewers. And then they too can join the fold and come armed every week in and week out, with the latest in news and analysis that you cannot find anywhere else. And if you find our services valuable to you, then there's a couple of things you can do to show your support. Of course, talk about us on Twitter, tell your friends is great. But what would really be nice is more money. Because it turns out making this podcast is not free. Not only does it represent a fairly significant time commitment from both, me and Arif and our producer James, the equipment we use costs money as well, and the internet that we use to bring you the show also costs us money. Website costs, bandwidth costs, taking care of all that stuff, just so we can keep pumping out awesome shows to you a couple of times a week during the season, and then once a week in the off season with maybe 1 or 2 unscheduled vacations in there somewhere. So if you would like to contribute monetarily to Norse Code, then paypal.me/Norse Code is a great place to go if you want to make just a one-time donation with your credit card or bank account or PayPal account in any amount you like. We suggest, dare I say it, $3.50.
$3.50.
There's a great image going around of the Loch Ness monster befriending like a very young girl when it's very young, and they have it shows them like the stages of life, and then they're both very old and sick, and the woman's sitting on a dock, and the elderly Loch Ness monster comes and puts its head in her lap and goes, "I need about $3.50." And that's I feel like where we're at with our listenership. We are laying our aging, graying head in your lap and saying, please give us about $3.50. If you would like to contribute that $3.50 on an ongoing, recurring, like maybe monthly basis, we would really love that. It makes it a lot easier for us to plan out our expenses for the year and all the cool things we can do for you if we have an idea of how much money is coming in on more than an episode-to-episode basis. And the link for that is patreon.com/NorseCode. So click away. Feel free to contribute as much or as little as you'd like, and know that your contribution goes directly towards bringing you a better Norse code. The one product that we make that is not a podcast, actually I have nothing to do with it other than some of the back end like sales type stuff. The product Arif makes that is not Norse code is an amazing training camp guide. Arif Hassan's 2016 Minnesota Vikings training camp guide, which is kind of a long name.
Yeah, the title has been a continuous work in progress that I've never worked on or am progressing towards fixing. But aside from perhaps the less catchy title, it's a labor of love. We've mentioned it obviously a couple of times on the podcast, but we implore you to purchase it in part because it helps support my work down at training camp, and in part because it's genuinely worth. I honestly believe it's genuinely worth the value that we've assigned to it. It's $25 and it's 50,000 words detailing all of the scouting reports for all 88, now 87. We'll talk about that in a second. Players in training camp. It's got a bunch of essays. I talk about momentum and the nature of momentum in football. I talk about analytics and the way that people have been treating it both inside the NFL and outside the NFL. And then, of course, I do, like Dusty mentioned, a bunch of scheme breakdowns. I talk about the offense in terms of the passing game, Tony Sperano's running game, which I don't think has really been broken down in this much detail quite yet. And then, of course, rehashing a lot of the stuff from the Mike Zimmer defense from a new perspective than I did last year. So all of that should give you a lot of value just to learn, and then also a lot of value to sort of win office conversations if you're really into that.
Exactly. And if you print out pages of the guide, you can have a visual aid as you beat down your coworkers at the cooler with more knowledge than you can shake a stick at. I think ultimate...
Throw note cards at them. Musgrave-sized note cards that you've printed out. Pages of the guide.
Cards. Like just read them as quickly as you can and then fling them at your victim. Dispense with thee. I think Ultimate Vikings Compendium would be a good name going forward, because that's really like hearing you describe it and having I have not read the entire thing because it is 50,000 words, but I have cherry picked here and there, and it really strikes me as more of a Vikings compendium than a training camp guide. But it is named what it is, and you can purchase it at norsecodepodcast.com/merch/guide. So do that. It's been a rough week for Minnesota Vikings football, I guess both football and personnel in, I don't know. It's 2016 has been a tough year for, celebrity deaths. A lot of the good ones have been taken away. And although if you look at his career in total, some people might disagree. I personally don't really know any Arizona Cardinals fans or Northwestern fans, I don't think. But I can tell you, Denny Green was one of the most amazing coaches that the Vikings have ever had. Probably the winningest coach the Vikings have ever had. And he passed away shortly after we recorded the podcast for last week. And we wanted to make a note of that and I guess take a remembrance lap around his 10-year, I guess, it's as successful as any coach could really be with the Vikings. He managed to preside over a 15-1 season before the dreadful Gary Anderson kick miss.
Yeah, no, it's interesting because I think that in retrospect, it's not until we sort of look down and break down, all of his accomplishments that we kind of really understand the coach that he is and was. Because I feel like during his tenure as a coach, he was never properly appreciated because he was either in the kind of the dead zone. I think it was between the 94 and 96 seasons. He was either in a dead zone where he had to prove that he could make it, or he was constantly sort of on the brink of failure. And a lot of people think of coaches like Marty Schottenheimer as ones who can never win the big one, who have these impressive regular season records and then never go on to make waves in the playoffs. But this is a big problem for Denny Green as well. And when we think about it at the time, we're just like, well, this is the team, this is the year, this is what we need to do. And if it's not, this is a failure. But, he himself was a victim of those high expectations because, after one season where they don't make the playoffs, he's out, right? And I think that it's kind of remarkable to think of a team that in 10 years with one head coach makes the playoffs 8 times and has a 61% win rate. It's one of the best win rates in NFL history, period. And that's up there with Bill Belichick and, Vince Lombardi and stuff like that. And with the Vikings over the course of 10 years, I mean, that's an incredible win rate. And I think one of the interesting differences between, what Lombardi was able to do or what Belichick was able to do. Not that, Denny Green is, this Hall of Fame better than everyone coach, but one reason that I think he's significantly underrated is that, all of these coaches got to work with Hall of Fame quarterbacks, Bart Starr, right? Tom Brady. And Denny Green is working with, a 39-year-old Warren Moon is working, with Salisbury, is working with, Brad Johnson and Jeff George and, the back end of Randall Cunningham's career and sort of the rocky beginning to Culpepper's career and sort of everything in between. It was 8 different quarterbacks, I think, that ended up playing significant snaps for him. And to make Jim McMahon, of course, and to make the playoffs in 8 of those 10 seasons is just a remarkable accomplishment. In retrospect, that seems nearly impossible. And so it feels like Green never got his due as an accomplished coach.
Well, how much of that do you think is kind of people seeing the rest of the offense in, those years where it was, Brad Johnson, Jeff George, and the back end of Randall Cunningham? Or no, the back end of his career.
Both, if he was willing to run it. So.
But I mean, those teams also, had Chris Carter in his prime, Randy Moss when he was young and possibly the most revolutionary receiver that the NFL had seen to that point. Players like John Randall. I mean, do you think that it was easier to dismiss Dennis Green because he had such offensive talent in like almost every area but quarterback?
I think a little bit. I think at the time, certainly, but I think that in retrospect, you always have to ask your question, why were those teams so talented? And you have to point to the capabilities that Denny Green has as a personnel scout. Something, I mean, one of the best draft classes ever was, Denny Green's 2004 class with Arizona. They got like Larry Fitzgerald and Darnell Dockett and a couple of other really good players. Antonio Smith, I think. And he's a big part of that personnel process. And then you also have to consider, like, as a coach, you're supposed to develop players. And, maybe Randy Moss would have been Randy Moss everywhere. I mean, that's true. But, I mean, there's a very talented offensive line. You had Robert Smith on some of those teams. And it would be ridiculous to say that talent, all of that talent, would always be there. I think a lot of that talent, you could attribute to Green and his coaching staff. And it's a phenomenal coaching staff. Some of it, are these, aged veterans that have been around the NFL for a long time that he worked with. And some of it, some of them are people that he helped mentor. A lot of people talk about, Brian Billick, winning a Super Bowl after creating a record-setting offense in 1998, winning a Super Bowl in 2000 with the Ravens. And Brian Billick served under Denny Green, on a later offensive staff. He had Mike Tice, and Mike Tice has constructed some pretty good offensive lines. Ended up actually being kind of an underrated head coach for the Minnesota Vikings. Then You've got, Tony Dungy, who, is a defensive guy, didn't work on the same side of the ball. But as the second black head coach in the Super Bowl era, sort of behind our shell, before the Rooney Rule, I think, people like Tony Dungy could, credit Denny Green for breaking barriers and could look up to, Denny Green and Green and Dungy were close. Dungy asked Green for advice, pretty consistently. So he was able to help mold Tony Dungy into sort of the head coach that he was, even if he didn't mold Tony Dungy into sort of the tactical, mind that Tony Dungy ended up being. And he worked with Monty Kiffin, sort of another old head, kind of like Tom Moore, who was the receivers coach under Denny Green. And they worked really well together, and they pioneered additional NFL concepts that Tony Dungy, along with Monty Kiffin, ended up taking to Tampa Bay, created the Tampa 2 defense. Tom Moore, the receivers coach, and he's been around the NFL for a long time, but he learned a lot in his time with Denny Green and Brian Billick. Even though he's older than both of them, and he was able to create a new standard of offense. I think we should call it the Tom Moore offense. Now, he took it to Pittsburgh. They did a very good job there, and then expanded it in Indianapolis with Peyton Manning. And people think about the Peyton Manning offense. It has like 20 plays in it. That's really Tom Moore who did all that. And I'll always stick up for Peyton Manning as the signal caller, as one of the last few quarterbacks who makes all these calls to the line of scrimmage. But Tom Moore really designed that offense, developed a young Peyton Manning, brought that offense. Peyton Manning ended up bringing that offense with Tom Moore as a consultant over to Denver. Adam Gase has taken a lot of that offense and taken it with him to Miami, but with a stop in Chicago. And the Tom Moore offense is one of the most effective offenses that we've seen in the NFL, and its reduction to simplicity is a good counter movement against sort of the West Coast offense of Bill Walsh, the evolution of the Erhard Perkins offense with Bill Belichick, and the way the Coryell offense has been moving forward. You've got this really simple offense that's been dominating the league. Tom Moore learned a lot of those things working with Denny Green. So even if you don't want to credit Denny Green for the work that he did in Minnesota, which I think is absurd. I think it's really difficult to do a 61% win rate over the course of 10 years. You could talk about the impact that he had as a head coach on other people who would end up becoming, really significant head coaches or really significant coordinators in the NFL that would help shape NFL history.
Well, and that's something, reading a lot of the kind of tributes to Green over the last week, what you hear a lot about is his mentorship. So many people had really good relationships with him in the league. So many players looked up to him. I read comments to the effect that Randy Moss, struggled attitude-wise without having Chris Carter and Denny Green to kind of mentor him and work with him in a way that was productive for everybody. And, we kind of saw that with his career with the Patriots and the Titans and the Patriots again. And
don't forget the Raiders.
Oh, and the Raiders. Yep. How could I forget? And the moment maybe not the moment, but the press conference where Denny Green was talking after Corey Stringer died, you could tell that he was invested in every single one of those players and that he loved the guys on his team. Like, he was as broken up, if not more, than anyone about what happened that day. And it showed. And he was, that was just the kind of guy he was. And so it's with great sadness that we mark his passing.
Yeah, I think Robert Smith, you tweeted out that when he was very young, he had lost his mother, and when Denny Green died, he felt like he had lost his father. So Green was very, very close to his players. It's pretty tragic.
So turning away from that,
so moving on to more cheerful things, I think.
Exactly. I will dab my eye with a Kleenex as I summon up the requisite hype for 2016 training camp.
Yeah. It'll be interesting. Like every year, obviously, there's a bunch of camp battles to follow. Obviously follow all of the Twitter feeds. It'll be doing like training camp play-by-play because that's really important to people. But yeah, there's a lot of unique questions that need to be resolved this year, as well as a lot of perennial questions that resolved sort of every year. Will the quarterback take the next step? Maybe we won't find out in training camp, but it will be interesting to break down sort of the receiver battles, the offensive line battles, what's going to happen at safety, and so on. So training camp is only 4 days away. We've talked about all of these storylines over the course of the offseason, and we finally get to see them resolved.
I am grateful that we will not have to, in the background, be asking ourselves the question, how long do we have before Matt Castle is our quarterback?
Yeah, no, that's a really nice question not to have to answer.
For a change, it's
a pretty stable quarterback situation.
Exactly. And at this moment, before a season filled with opportunity, it'll be like this. This really does, I enjoy that phrase, and I intend to drive it into the ground over the course of the season.
Deploy it as often as possible.
Yeah, exactly. But it really is like, this feels more like our year than any year since Denny Green. Like even the, unlikely 2012 campaign, this is it. And
yeah, no, I think so. The 2012 campaign, I think, was a surprise to everyone. I think even the players on the team.
Yeah.
The last time it felt like it could be a year for the Vikings, I think it was 2010. You couldn't say that about 2009 because we didn't have a quarterback until like basically the season started, and then he turned out to be amazing. But yeah, I think the last time we could have ever even felt it was quote unquote our year was 2010, because in 2009, when it was an amazing year, I don't think anyone anticipated it happening, and in fact, even in the first couple of games, people were very tentative. You didn't have a quarterback to start the season. You didn't show up until basically the season started, and he turned out to be magical sometime around week 3, and that's kind of when you felt, maybe there's something here. And in 2010, after the year ended, I think everyone figured that this would be the last 2010, if possible, would be the last year that things could get done, if they could get done. But everyone knew that the Vikings were living on borrowed time. I mean, they had to deal with, the aging defensive line with the Williams and Jared Allen, and they had to deal with, obviously, the aging Brett Favre. You had to deal with, the fact that Steve Hutchinson was old, and, most of the offensive line was aged, and that the only young players were the receivers, like Sidney Rice and Percy Harvin. And so 2010, there was always this background before the season started that we were like, well, they could fall off this year, right? Maybe that was Favre's last gasp, and it was. And I don't think we're getting that. Like in 2012, it was a surprise. 2010, you couldn't have anticipated how bad it was, but you could see it falling off a cliff pretty quickly. And I think this year, everyone has a really good sense that this is just a genuinely good team, and they've got a great chance of making the playoffs and then also doing damage once they're in the playoffs. And if you can do damage in the playoffs, I think both Super Bowl winning Giants teams recently have shown you can evidently win the whole thing.
No, it's really exciting, and the chance to see some of our unknown quantities this coming week will. My hope is that it's very comforting for everyone. I'm looking forward to the various silly storylines that come out of it, and I guess secretly, if or not, any of the new talent might be a sleeper pick for fantasy.
Yeah, no, it'll be interesting to find out. There aren't any skill players that'll probably surprise. I guess a surprise training camp story that you wouldn't necessarily expect is, maybe Michael Pruitt takes the tight end, one position from Kyle Rudolph. That would be an interesting fantasy, story. Other than that, people kind of expect Laquan Treadwell to at some point do something. Charles Johnson was starting, so if he ends up starting the year, he's starting at OTA, so if he ends up starting the year, that wouldn't be a huge surprise because a rookie has to be eased in. Stephon Diggs is Stephon Diggs. He'll either produce a lot or he'll prove that his rookie was a fluke season. None of those will be surprises. Adrian Peterson's going to run the ball a lot, so it'll be interesting to see if maybe the tight end group could produce a surprise. But from a fantasy perspective, it'll be kind of interesting because there's not that many fantasy relevant outcomes that would be huge surprises.
So another Vikings news this week. Both of these stories breaking in the last, 24 hours, right?
Yeah, both of these hugely significant stories.
Well, maybe the less significant of the two is that Greg Jennings has decided to retire.
Greg Jennings, 10-year NFL vet, best receiver on the 2013 Vikings, retired. What a mentor. We'll always remember your time in Miami, Greg.
Exactly. What leadership?
So there's this really weird thing. It's been difficult for me to word it in tweets or in articles, but have you seen any videos that Greg Jennings has put out ever?
Oh, the Be Great stuff.
Yeah, the Be Great stuff.
Nope.
He put out like a retirement video. He also put out that like prank video about where he'll be going next year on April Fools or whatever. Just like any video in general, or you can just look at his Twitter profile or his Twitter background. He seems like really crazy polished, right? Just like not even just like as a player, but like as a person, right?
Well, maybe that's probably his obvious next step. You know, maybe he's going to bridge the gap between like NFL commentary and YouTube star. Like I
wouldn't be surprised if NFL commentary was in his future.
Well, and I get why. Like I've never watched any of the Be Great stuff. Like that's the sort of YouTube really appeals to a somewhat younger crowd than me. I mean, I know most people under the age of 20 get almost all their video content from YouTube, and I am simply not that way. So that sort of has passed me by. But you know, I did watch his retirement video. Because I saw it in the small amount of show prep I did. And that struck me too. He is extremely telegenic. He's extremely comfortable in front of a camera. And that smile. Wow.
Yeah, no, I think that the odd thing is I think that he knows it. And I don't want to say it comes off as fake because I don't necessarily think it's fake. But it feels like if you were to put together a football family on TV, he would be the product. And I don't really mean that as a criticism, but it's just kind of like a weird feeling I get from having followed Greg Jennings for like 3 years. And I think, I guess he was this way in Green Bay too, but like he is really aware that he is a product and he is willing to be as corny as possible in order to sort of market that product.
Well, that's fine. And that's like, you don't see that kind of meta level self-awareness from
you not very often, no.
Sports personalities. Like Bomani Jones has kind of a sense of humor about himself, but he also engages a lot of Twitter trolls. So
yeah, and you could say JJ Watt, but I mean, there's like this sense underneath JJ Watt that like, he probably believes all this weird stuff that he's saying. So
well, and could you ever really get in a feud with Greg Jennings? Like, does he take himself seriously enough to where he would actually be hurt by what somebody else said about him?
I don't think you'd ever find evidence of that.
No, I
don't think you'd ever find evidence that he got hurt by what somebody said about him.
Exactly. I think that would not be in line with his brand and consequently may as well not even exist.
Right, exactly. So I'm kind of interested to see how Greg Jennings' career progresses. It was interesting. I remember, when he was prepping for that Super Bowl, when people asked him about that Madden video, it was interesting to see him respond because a Madden video contains a lot of profanity that is off-brand for Greg Jennings. But yeah, I think it's kind of funny and really cool that one of the lasting legacies of Greg Jennings is a YouTube video of someone playing Madden. But it is one of the greatest YouTube videos of Madden ever, if not the greatest.
Excellent. Maybe we can link to that one so that
we'll probably put it in the show notes or something.
Excellent. More important for the Vikings, but maybe less important for the world of football broadcasting. Phil Loadholt is retiring as well after apparently suffering a setback in the weight room, an injury setback in the weight room.
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure. I guess he was working out in Houston for this tweet from Chris Thomason. I always pronounce his name wrong. I don't know why. But yeah, I guess he's working out in Houston, and yes, it wasn't an Achilles setback per the tweet, but it was an injury to the leg of some sort, and he would not have been ready for camp. And I think if you're Phil Loadholt and you've played like 24 or whatever consecutive games out of 30, or you've missed 24 consecutive games out of 32, and there's an injury right before camp, I mean, and you're 31 or whatever, that retirement makes a lot of sense. Like, I think a lot of people thought, and this didn't get tweeted out a ton, so I think this kind of got lost in sort of the Phil Loadholt mess when people were kind of like trying to figure things out, and then Josh Gordon got reinstated, so the Phil Loadholt stuff got washed away. But I was surprised by it. A lot of people, I think were surprised by it. I think no one who covered the Vikings generally, saw this coming. And I think the reason is this unreported thing, or this thing that isn't well circulated by Chris Thomason, is that it's not that Phil Loadholt wasn't recovering. 'Cause he gave an interview, and I remember I was listening to Judd Mackey this morning, actually. And Judd, the cynic that he is, played a clip from like 3 weeks ago about Phil Loadholt saying, I'm not even worried about I don't even think about that injury. I just go out there and think about sort of the new scheme that's being installed. And, I'm thinking about football. It's not even on my mind. And, that clip combined with the fact that he just retired is kind of funny and kind of maybe don't take any player seriously when they say they're in the best shape of their life. And that's a pretty good lesson in general to learn. But maybe in this case, maybe it's just because he suffered a setback and he didn't want to go through another season injured. Like, who would sign him after that anyway? He was on a 1-year deal. You miss a third year. There's no way he's going to say he might as well retire on his own terms. So it was a huge surprise to me. It was a huge surprise, I think, to a lot of people. Some people weren't surprised because they knew he was injured going in. But I guess the thing that caused the problem was not this injury. It was just that he's kind of sick of all these repeated injuries.
You spend a year and a half rehabilitating this or that thing. And then, last year he was in the preseason where he tears his Achilles and boom, out for the season. After spending all this time, learning the scheme and getting psyched up to play and, taking care of his body and all that stuff, boom, setback. And then this year, a week out, maybe 2 weeks out from training camp, again, after an offseason filled with, rehab and workouts and getting himself back up to speed, another setback. At some point, you just have to take it as a sign, especially when, you've already been in the league for 9 years?
He got drafted in 2009, so pretty close to 9 years. This would have been like his 7th.
Okay, so seven. He's in the league for 7 years functionally. He played for 5.5, and especially if he's coming into training camp battling for his own position against another talented veteran. At some point you just got to be like, well, like you said, maybe it's best to just go out on my own terms.
Right, and if he couldn't play at the beginning of training camp, it's not going to be much of a competition, right? So
exactly.
Yeah. So that would maybe be one of the most frustrating things on the planet to just deal with. So yeah, no, I guess that's what's happened. A little retrospective on Phil Loadholt because I think that he's been consistently underrated by the Vikings fan base and by I think people in general. I think that between 2009 and 2011, between that time, I think a lot of people. Their beat on Loadholt was correct. It was pretty accurate. He was a pretty subpar pass protector. He was a pretty good-ish run blocker. He suffered from a lot of penalties, especially false starts. Everyone kind of remembers that. But also holding, right? And those penalty flags were infuriating. The pass protection failures, especially against quicker edge rushers, also infuriating. But I think people got an image of their mind of who Phil Loadholt was and didn't allow sort of new evidence, and especially because it's an offensive lineman, and it's difficult to change what you know about an offensive lineman because you're not watching them on every snap, and it's difficult to. The broadcast doesn't even let you often. But in 2012 and 2013, he was one of the top right tackles in the league. I know Pro Football Focus rated him as the second or third or whatever, but you don't really have to take a look at the ratings, the grades to see it. He only had 6 penalties over the course of those 2 years, whereas he was averaging something like 11 prior to that, 11 penalties a year. 6 over the course of 2 years, which is phenomenal improvement in terms of penalty. Gave up far fewer sacks, and a lot of the weaknesses that he had were the same. He was still slow moving to the edge. He still had some issues oversetting. He still had some issues with agility and so on, but he overcame those by refining his strengths to take into account his weaknesses. So long as he always got his hands first on somebody, it was very difficult for them to get past them, even if they were quicker. He could punch people off the line, and he got a lot better in pass protection, got a lot better even in run blocking. And so he was a pretty great right tackle. And so I was kind of excited to see what would happen in 2016 if he could regain that 2013 form. And that's not something we're going to see, which is really unfortunate because one of the reasons I thought the line would improve is because of a competition between Loadholt and Smith.
Yeah, and I've been in the pro Loadholt camp for a while. The false starts and the holding penalties are very frustrating, but they provided an easy excuse to blame the refs for biased officiating. And
that's true.
And the thing is, when you're a tackle, people only really notice your position because, like you were saying, of the way that the NFL kind of designs their broadcasts, they really only notice you when you screw up. Like when you blow a coverage or somebody gets by you, then it's like, oh, it's that terrible tackle again. But if he's doing his job right, if he's pushing off one guy and then stopping a second one from making it to the quarterback, then he's doing a great job. But you're never going to see him in a highlight reel. So
yeah, no, for sure. And if you see the same guy for 3 years, you see him, 30 times on your screen over the course of the 3 years, and that gave you an impression of that guy. When you see him the next year and you only see him 2 times, it's just natural for human brains to just be like to reinforce it those 2 times and not think about the other 15 times they didn't see them that year, right? Like, I mean, that's just how, like we said, that the broadcast works. And so, unfortunately, it really hides a lot of the improvement that Loadholt had, and a lot of maybe what Viking fans could look forward to this year, because the right tackle position that they had was the worst along the offensive line, despite the best or maybe worst efforts of Brandon Fusco and Matt Khalil. One thing that's interesting to me about this is that, for me, the idea of Loadholt and Andre Smith competing at the right tackle spot was a really appealing idea, because no matter what happened, no matter who won, you'd always have a benchmark that the person that won the job would be better than this other person who I am reasonably sure is at least average, or maybe a little bit below average because of the way Andre Smith has played over the last couple of years. Which means the person who won the job, they're better than someone who's below average. There's a good chance they're at least average, if not better. It felt like there was some level of insurance there. Maybe assurance is a better word, because it created a bar somewhere. And now that bar doesn't exist, right? Now there's no, now Andre Smith has the job, and maybe he'll be good. He hasn't been good for the past 2 years. Maybe he'll be good, because of Tony Sperano, or because he's on a 1-year contract, and because he doesn't have because the team didn't draft 2 tackles in that draft immediately in order to replace him, whatever reason, right? Maybe he'll be good, but you don't have the same kind of assurance that there's a baseline that this person has to clear in order to be, guaranteed this job spot. So I think that increases maybe a level of anxiety coming from that side of the field.
There doesn't seem to be, maybe everybody was just so shocked that there wasn't time for a whole lot of hand-wringing, but it doesn't seem like there's a great, Sturm und Drang over who's going to play at right tackle. Like, okay, Andre Smith, I guess that's fine. We did trade for him. He is a veteran. Although we'll never know if he's better than Phil Loadholt, or if he could win a competition at right tackle against Phil Loadholt, and we'll never know if Phil Loadholt was good enough to win a right tackle competition against Andre Smith. So
and one thing that you bring up about Smith being, well, now he's the right tackle. We had a question from a Norse Code listener, Logan Reed, who asked, with Loadholt's retirement, is Smith the unquestioned right tackle with Clemmings and Khalil competing for left tackle? Or is Khalil the unquestioned left tackle with Clemmings and Smith competing at right tackle? Addendum, Logan Reed added, I don't feel like TJ could compete at both while still actually competing at either, which is a pretty good point. To that end, I think this is kind of interesting. So Clemmings at the beginning of the offseason and throughout most of the offseason switched to left tackle and only played there. The last, part of the offseason, right before OTAs ended, he did swing a little bit on the right side. And some people were saying, we've got this indication. If he played on the right side a little bit, maybe that's an indication that they kind of knew that this was coming. And it sounds like maybe they didn't because of the setback that happened in Houston only 2 weeks ago. But with that in mind, I think that they're probably going to be thinking about it. But one of the issues that TJ Clemmings had is that he didn't have his footwork down. He didn't have a lot of his technique down. He didn't have a lot of what he needed to have fundamentally, basically, as an offensive lineman down. Switching to footwork is really going to confuse it. I think, Logan, that you're right that TJ can't compete at both, but I think he's also not competing. I think that he's just earning a backup spot, and he's competing against other potential backups. I don't know that there's anybody competing at a tackle spot right now, which is pretty worrisome, I guess, but I didn't expect anyone but Khalil to win the left tackle spot. And if Clemmings had won it, I actually would have been ecstatic because, that means he had to clear a bar. Kind of the same thing with the Smith Loadholt thing.
Yeah,
but I just didn't see it as likely as happening, and I don't see Clemmings competing with Andre Smith for that right tackle spot either. I think that we're not going to see Clemmings sort of fully develop as an offensive lineman, barring injury, until next year.
So what we're really hoping for, no matter who else ends up on the field, is not Fusco and not Clemmings.
Maybe not Fusco. It's super curious because if Fusco just did suffer from like a pec injury last year, and he doesn't have to deal with like left guard footwork, which I guess is not something he can do. Maybe he ends up being better than Harris, but I thought Harris was really good last year, so Harrison Boone at guard will be better than Harrison Fusco at guard. So, if it is Fusco, I'm not that concerned because I just don't see a situation where his play last year could not be attributable to the pectoral injury he suffered a year prior to that. So
there's no way he could be
not
that
Clemmings, but maybe Fusco.
Okay. So the prognosis for the Vikings offensive line, pretty much the same, maybe slightly less enthusiasm.
Yeah, I think there's less enthusiasm, which makes sense. You lost a potential starter, but I mean you signed a starter basically to sort of resolve that. I think the bigger impact will be felt sort of throughout the rest of the roster, or I think that you can be a little bit more confident that Willie Beavers makes the roster. So one of the issues with the offensive line is that there were 10 players that I thought maybe not locks, but very, very difficult to get rid of and very difficult to have an argument that you wouldn't want on the offensive line. Those are, whoever the 5 starters are going to be. So let's say Khalil, Boone, Sullivan, Harris, and Loadholt, right? And then the other 5 were people, 4 of them started 16 consecutive games. So that's, Berger, Clemmings, I guess Fusco in this situation, and Smith. Right, and then the 5th one is Zach Kieran, who the Vikings like a lot at center, who played a lot of center and guard in the preseason and seems to be rotating first-team snaps at both center and guard with this offensive line in mini camps and OTAs. Those 10 are much more likely to make the roster, in my opinion, than Willie Beavers. And teams rarely, very, very rarely carry 11 offensive linemen into the regular season. Now, they don't have to. And some people, in this offensive line math became so difficult that some people were talking about, and they had some pretty decent arguments, that the Vikings would end up cutting or trading whoever lost the right tackle position. But I don't agree with that argument because then you still have the best right tackle backup in the league or whatever, and that's worth the small amount of money you'd be paying either of them. But, I mean, now you don't have to worry about that roster math, and that might clear some things up on the defensive backs. I mean, it has rippling effects. Like maybe that allows the Vikings to keep more safety so they have safety depth or competition throughout the year at safety. Maybe it allows them to keep 6 cornerbacks because, I mean, who do you get rid of between like Mackenzie Alexander and Trey Waynes and Terrence Newman and Xavier Rhodes and Captain Munnerlyn and punt returner Marcus Sherrill? I mean, that's 6 cornerbacks. So maybe this allows them to keep 6 cornerbacks, whereas prior they would not have been able to keep 6 cornerbacks. So it has an interesting ripple effect. Maybe they only keep 5 cornerbacks and they keep 7 receivers, and that opens up space for Moritz. It has an interesting ripple effect throughout the rest of the roster in a way that is pretty unanticipated, but kind of eases some pressure.
Looks like Loadholt's contract was about $4 million for this year. Or no,
if it was $4 million, that's a little surprising, but I should have looked at the numbers. He restructured it this year to make it smaller, so that could be the deal.
That is the restructured deal. The original cap contract before March was, according to this Daily Norseman article that we'll link, $7.75 million.
Oh, right, because when he signed the contract, he was the highest paid right tackle in the league, and I defended that. So yeah, restructuring it to $4 million makes a lot of sense.
Restructured to $2 million base salary, up to $3.5 million with incentives. I think that's still either a 3.5, maybe $4 million cap hit, or I'm not exactly sure how that works. At any rate, the Vikings are going to save a few million
cap
bucks.
hit is difficult to calculate because it depends on whether or not the incentives are "quote unquote" likely to be earned, which are dependent upon prior performance last year, which those last year numbers don't exist. So who knows?
Okay. So, but at any rate, the Vikings are going to save at least a guaranteed $2 million not having to pay Phil Loadholt this year.
Yeah, I'm not so sure that they'll use that money for anything this year, but because the cap rolls over, or cap space rolls over, they could use it next year.
So not a terrible deal for the Vikings. Let's, I guess now we'll all be watching Andre Smith a little more closely.
For sure.
Laquan Treadwell claims that he was never fully 100% healthy in 2015 in another piece of evidence for your claim that you should just never take players at their word when they're talking about themselves. Another interview with Chris Thomason. Treadwell says, I was definitely tentative. I wasn't 100% at all last season. I would just say so to get everyone off of me. I was like, I can't focus on what I need to focus on because everybody's asking me every day what I felt, what percentage I was. I just said, I feel good. I'm 100%. But then after I went home at night, I was like, I don't feel right.
Yeah, no, and there's an interesting story there about how he would cry himself to sleep from the pain in his foot and how he wanted to remember the pain so that he wouldn't take anything for granted. It's a pretty good story. Treadwell uses some pretty evocative language, so maybe he could become a storyteller after all this is over. But yeah, it's interesting to put into context some of the discussions that we had. Remember when we had John Moore at the CFX on, and we talked about Treadwell's numbers, which as an aggregate unit don't look good based on what numbers we know can provide us with some predictive value in terms of how wide receivers do in the NFL. And John Moore, who created these numbers and allowed us to, and added an age adjustment to the numbers and really sort of pioneered a model that allowed us to predict these things. In that model, Laquan Treadwell doesn't look good, and Moore defended Treadwell by saying, well, I mean, think about it. I mean, this is a player that came off of like a tibia fracture, and at the beginning of the year, his numbers were awful, and they improved throughout the season, which is consistent with what you'd expect someone recovering from injury to do. And he's right. If you only take a look at the second half of Treadwell, and this is something, in my Laquan Treadwell scouting report piece, this is something I hadn't considered until we had actually talked to John about this, and had decided to split my observations in half. The second half of the Treadwell season was a lot better than the first half of the Treadwell season, and it's not something I had considered when I said that Treadwell wasn't a very good first round prospect at receiver. And if you have the 2014 Treadwell, I think that you by far have the best receiver in the class and the best receiver of the prior class. Maybe I'm a huge fan of Amari Cooper, but so maybe that's not quite true. But you have an incredible receiver, and so if it's the case, that's true, then you kind of have to ask yourself the question: can he ever recover to his 2014 form, or is he like Kyle Rudolph, who's always had this nagging injury that he's always going to be on the cusp of getting past, but then never quite getting past? I mean, and that's going to be my example, maybe ad infinitum, like until the end of time, when we talk about like injury sustaining college, whether or not players can recover from them. And the other end of that is Keenan Allen, who didn't have a spectacular final sort of showing, and was recovering from injury and had a very poor pro day as a result. Hey, Treadwell, right? And then eventually came on that season to become a very good receiver and is now in the conversation to be sort of one of the better tier 2 receivers in the NFL, and could, sort of make that jump from Keenan Allen to where he is to maybe eventually to where sort of like DeAndre Hopkins is. So it's going to be interesting to see what direction that takes, but I think it provides an explanation for what happened, but it doesn't provide us with much predictive value about what will happen.
So is there any point in asking him how he's feeling at training camp?
No, but we're going to do it.
Because there is a slim chance that he might say something other than 100%, which, given what he said in the past, is an opportunity to read even further into the tea leaves for a deep dive, let's say.
Right.
I don't know. I guess, boy, we hit on all the big news items, and the email question from Logan was really the only thing we had in the mailbag. This episode was kind of thrown together impromptu at the last moment due to scheduling difficulties. But given that training camp is a mere 4 days away, we did want to cram one more episode in before we get Arif on location at the event. I guess maybe a couple more small items before we wrap it up.
Yeah, I'm just going over some of the pieces I've written this week. I wrote a piece over at Cold Omaha about undrafted free agents to watch. I isolated 3 undrafted free agents who I actually think none of them will make the roster this year, but I think they've all got a really good chance to make the practice squad this year, and that they have an opportunity in 2017 to make the roster and make an impact. And so those are people that I'm kind of interested in, that I think really show the kind of things that Zimmer wants to see for players at their position. and are sort of primed to be in a spot where they can do something. So, that's a piece I called Omaha that I think is worth, going into. Undrafted free agents are always, they're critically important to the way a team operates. Every team will have a starter. Basically every team, I shouldn't say every team, but basically every team will have a starter who's an undrafted free agent. The Vikings have a few. I mean, obviously Andrew Sendejo started at safety last year. Zach Lyons starting fullback. Mike Harris was the starting guard last year. There's a good chance of being starting guard this year. And on and on and on, right? And even on special teams, like Adam Thielen's one of the best special teamers. He's an undrafted free agent. So they're critical parts of the team. And every team relies on undrafted free agents to construct a big portion of their roster, including consistently good teams like the Seahawks and the Patriots. It's always difficult to tell who those guys are going to be, and sometimes you can't tell for a couple of years because they take a couple of years to come along. So it's always sort of difficult, and most of the time when you're hyped about an undrafted free agent, I mean, it means nothing. It means absolutely nothing. The hit rate for undrafted free agents versus the number that you bring into camp is obviously the lowest for a bunch of obvious reasons. But these are three people who I think have a better chance than most, which is not to say the other 7 undrafted free agents don't have a chance at all. I'm interested in them. The other piece I wrote is going to be published probably by the time you hear this at purpleptsd.com. And it's about the fact that a bunch of people, and some people we've had on the show, a bunch of people have done a bunch of long-form analysis on Teddy Bridgewater. I mean, I've done it, of course, but there's other people like Keen Fahey over at Football Guys, and Pre-Snap Reads has done it, also Football Outsiders. Derek Clausen, who we just had on the show, has done a deep dive on Teddy Bridgewater. Pro Football Focus just tweeted out a thing about Teddy Bridgewater that people seem to have taken umbrage to, which is that he's a top 15 quarterback, which is not that bold of a statement. If you're a top 15 quarterback, you're probably not a top 10 quarterback, which means you're probably an average quarterback. But whatever. There's been a lot of deep statistical and film analysis done on Teddy, and I kind of wanted to explore why that was, and if there's a consensus forming around Teddy from people who do, more in-depth work on Bridgewater versus, the sort of the mainstream analysis that, Bridgewater is not good or something. I don't know.
I would take issue with the characterization of Teddy as a top 15 quarterback just because I have this, outlandish belief that he could be a top 10 quarterback this year. But
okay, so I was having this discussion too, and I think he's actually got a pretty decent argument for being a top 10 quarterback. So
exactly.
But I mean, that take is a little too hot for people. So
that's a bit much. Let's wait until the season starts, and then we can be right later on.
Right, and the good thing is, if he's not a top 10 quarterback, we can just say we walked it back. But if he is a top 10 quarterback, we can say it was on the podcast. We said he was a top 10 quarterback.
Exactly. We've been saying this since before the season even started, as he's collecting his league MVP and deferring on the Pro Bowl because he has to play in the Super Bowl.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah. And if those things happen, then I will feel like a master level hot take artist.
Right. I'm gonna have to tell the Dallas Morning News to sort of move over. We've got a new hot take artist in town.
Exactly. I was not being facetious. That was an actual prediction. No, I don't know.
And on that note, it's a good place to end the episode.
Yep. I think we hit all our marks. Please check out the training camp guide and NorseCodePodcast.com just in general for all your Norse code needs. Daily Norseman as well. You can find all the Vikings news you need and actually some pretty good editorials as well from some good friends of the show. So make sure you check out dailynorseman.com. Our Facebook page is facebook.com/dailynorseman. Our Twitter account is @NorseCodeDN. You can tweet us your mailbag questions anytime, and we will read them, most of them, on the air. If you prefer to submit by email, or if you're not a big fan of Twitter, which, I guess I understand, but why would you want to live like that? It's so weird. I hear people like, oh, I hate Twitter. I don't understand it. And I'm like, I can't imagine my life without it. That'd be weird. At any rate, you can email us at norsecodepodcast@gmail.com. I am at Dusty O'Connell on Twitter. Our intrepid producer is at Big Mono on Twitter. And the most useful human of the three of us Arif Hassan is at Arif Hassan NFL. So give him a follow for, I guess, the latest in Pokemon news.
You're right. We can go in depth on that. I'm probably going to be doing Pokemon breakdowns at training camp too. Also, being from the Midwest, I feel really weird accepting the compliment as being the most useful human of the three of you. So I will just politely decline that and just say I am a useful human of at least three.
A generally useful human. I think we'll stick with that tagline for now.
All right.
At any rate, email us your questions, tweet us your questions or comments. We're still accepting submissions for a new tagline / stinger to cry out gleefully at the end of every episode. Christian Ponder still sucks, although I hear he raced down a school bus to recover an object his daughter left behind on it, like an art project.
Oh, that's adorable.
Or something. Sam Ponder posted on Twitter that...
Is that the daughter named after Jimbo Fisher?
Maybe.
I was about to say I totally forgot he had a daughter, and then I totally remembered he had a daughter because I think he named her after Jimbo Fisher. If not, he named her after Jimbo Fisher's predecessor at Florida State.
Either way, upon Sam discovering that their daughter had forgotten the object, she called him in a panic, and he dropped what he was doing, ran to his car, chased down the bus. I don't know how he got them to pull over, but that's part of Christian Ponder's magic, I guess.
He's Christian Ponder. He's sneaky athletic.
But he sucks at football.
It was Bobby Bowden, so it's Jimbo Fisher's predecessor at Florida State. So Bowden St. Clair Ponder, who is evidently being raised by a caring father, and all signs indicate a very loving mother.
The rarely seen lasty. That's impressive. Christian Ponder has excellent daughter naming skills, but sucks at football, which you may recall was our tagline 2 years ago. Last year, of course, keep Teddy alive, which thankfully we did. And this year, hopefully something new. So please submit your contributions. And we will return next week with the first update from training camp. Thanks to all of our listeners for hooking us up with, well, actually hooking a reef up with a portable hotspot, so he will have hot and fresh internet access everywhere he goes. He will be the envy of sideline reporters who do not have portable MiFi at training camp. And if you would like to throw in for that sort of thing, paypal.me/NorseCode and patreon.com/NorseCode. So until next week, keep Teddy alive.
Norse Code is the official podcast of the Daily Norseman SB Nation blog and is produced with cooperation from Pompous Jerk Productions. Pompous Jerk Productions. Attitude with attitude. The opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of their contributors and do not reflect official positions of the Minnesota Vikings, SB Nation, the Daily Norseman staff, or PJP. No information in this podcast should be construed as gambling advice. Please obey all local gaming laws.
Our formula is this. We go out, we hit people in the mouth.